And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Cindy Smith currently serves as a lecturer and researcher in educational psychology in the School of Education at Curtin University. She has extensive experience conducting research regarding educational and behavioral outcomes of children with disabilities, also fidelity of classroom teaching and program development. She is particularly interested in the research areas of mentoring to support effective teacher training, as well as student learning. That was very brief. There's a lot more to tell about Cindy's very interesting career, but who better to tell you about it than Cindy herself? And I must say I've been eagerly anticipating this talk for quite some time, so please let's welcome Cindy up to the front.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that kind introduction. I hope after I've talked a while, you all are still as happy to have me here as you are when I start. But I'm really glad to be able to talk to you tonight. I would also like to, who do I signal for my slides to change? There we go, yeah. So I would also like to acknowledge that I live and work on Whadjuk Booja, and I pay respect to all elders past and present because they're the senior knowledge holders of Australia. I also recognize that this country was never ceded. It is and always will be Whadjuk Booja. I also acknowledge the contributions of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians because they hold the memories, the knowledge and truth and cultures of these lands. I also want to acknowledge the native lands of my birth, the people of the Cherokee Nation in the United States of America, and all the scholars and truth seekers that live there. I also recognize the native lands that are represented by all the participants of this evening's events and pay respects to all of your past and current knowledge holders of those lands. But particularly, I want to acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of those of us who add to the richness of our societies because of their unique talents, skills, and insights because of their neurodiversity. Yeah, you can change. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about my faith journey, my science, my life calling, my journey, and the intersections of this, because you really can't, I don't feel like I can't separate one of these. It's all together. It's all intertwined. Sometimes I used to try, and I just don't anymore, yeah. So my background, I grew up in a really tiny community in northeast Missouri, in the United States, right in the center. We were a long way from any kind of oceans. It was a very small, rural farming community. As a child, I was a member of the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. As an adult, I was a member of Methodist Church. Currently, I'm a member here at South Perth. My grandmother was a really big influence in my Christian journey. She was also a teacher. So she had a lot of influence over me. You'll see that this picture there, that's my father. And yes, he's there by an emu. We were in the middle of Missouri, and we raised emus. Yeah, who would know? But he had, one of them was named Matilda. One of them was named, I don't know. But anyway, you can see two of the chicks there. One morning they got into a fight, and he got between them and tried to, separate them. And he came in all, bunged up on his face. It was crazy. But anyway, we're always doing different things. My community was very, very neighborly and caring. We were the original free-range kids. You know, you go out and you ride your bikes, and as long as you come home before it's dark, and if you did do anything you weren't supposed to, your mom knew about it before you got home. You know, as everybody looked out for everybody. But it was very supportive and caring, but you needed to be a Christian, you needed to be white, you needed to be straight, and you needed, if you're a woman, you needed to follow the rules that were set out by the men in the community. I wasn't ever really good at that. I got in trouble a lot. Yeah. So to give you a little bit of context, and maybe, yeah, everybody knows exactly where Missouri's at, but Missouri is right in the middle of that. You see where it says Jefferson City, St. Louis. So this was the area that I lived in. So the whole state of Missouri is very, very rural. There's St. Louis on one side, which is a big city. There's the St. Louis Arch and everything. Kansas City is on the other side. Right through the middle of it goes Highway 70, and in about halfway through is Columbia, Missouri, where I went to university. So I'm going to tell you more about that in a little bit. But over on the journeys that I've had, and still the collaborations I have with people, are all over the United States. Right now, I'm collaborating with a charter school in Panama City, Florida. They're actually going to come here. They're going to be in Perth in July. They're just coming just to support some of the work that we do at their own expense, I might say, too. I've got some things to show you tonight on the East Coast, so in New York and Washington, D.C. One of my PhD students and I just presented at a conference in D.C. a couple of months ago. Over on the other side in Oregon, that is University of Oregon, plays a lot of importance to my background and the things that I've learned. You've heard of PBS in schools, positive behavior support. That was started at the University of Oregon. Dr. Lewis, who was one of my advisors, graduated from the University of Oregon, took that to the University of Missouri. So this is just I've got a lot of pictures tonight, and I thought rather than having dot points or things that you probably don't want to read, I like pictures. So this up in this corner, with all the little kids sitting, and there's the woman and then the girl underneath her that the dress is alike. So the woman is my grandmother. She was my first grade teacher, and of course she made us dresses alike that we had to wear on picture day. And then this where everybody has the red robes on. So this is that same class when we graduated high school. And Grandma came back. By that time, she was about ready to retire. And she said, I want a picture with the same class, because she had taught us in year 1 and then also in year 6. So she followed us all the way through. And then these awful-looking old people over here is the same group again at I think it was our either 35th or 40-year anniversary or, class reunion, that type of thing. And then there's some other pictures of me. You'll see I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And that played a lot into my faith development, and also what I studied at university and my theoretical background, because the 60s and 70s in the United States was a big time of change, of social change of ideas. People were questioning a lot of things, and the cheerleading skirt. The other skirts I wore weren't any longer than that, too. That was the age of mini skirts. And then my mom and dad over here with my little brother. I had one brother. He was born when I was about 13. Mom and dad thought I was always going to be an only child, and then, he came around. He was absolutely a horribly, horribly behaved child. They treated him like a grandchild. And of course, I was, as a big sister, I always got the brunt of it. Yeah. So when I grew up, I was just barely 18. I got married. I didn't need to go to university. I knew everything there was to know. I was going to be a farm wife and live on a farm in Missouri for the rest of my life and go to church and do everything I was supposed to do. Didn't work out quite that way. I did have these 3 beautiful boys that are up here in the corner, and then Wendy came along much later. She's down here. Has anybody read Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, any of that? So the town that I lived in was Hannibal, Missouri. That was actually where Samuel Clemens set his stories. And Wendy and her friend there are doing the fence painting. Every 4th of July, they have the fence painting contest. If you haven't read the books, you got to go read it, and you'll see about the fence painting contest. This picture over here, I think is neat. This is 4 generations. This is my grandfather, who was a farmer. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. Grandpa farmed with horses. He never had a tractor on his farm. When he was in his early 80s, I think, and he was so excited because there was about 10 Amish families that moved in. They bought some land and they moved in around there. He had somebody to, fix all of his harness for his horses. He was so excited. He considered joining the Amish church, but you have to learn German. You have to speak German. He decided he was too old to learn German. He wasn't going to. But anyway, that was my Grandpa Gooden, and my dad sitting next to him, and then me with my oldest son. So it's 4 generations. I thought that was kind of cool. And then on the other side, there's, Wendy and me are there in the cave, again, Mark Twain Cave, and then one of my little grandchildren. This, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but this down here is my husband's family, who is my husband's now, not my children's father, but he is English, and this was our first visit after we got married to England. He's taken the picture, so he's done it, but it's all of his mother and his brother and all of his family. Right in the middle of there, somebody was saying here they were from, or had been in South Carolina for a while. On the one with all the water, the woman in the white is my mother's youngest sister, my Aunt Frankie. She thinks I'm great, and I think she's great. But anyway, we're here. They're from, this was in South Carolina, just on the coast. We were there. So to give you a little bit of a context of universities in the United States, and some of this, you all are all academic, a lot of you are academic science people, so this may be old hat to you, and if it is, I apologize. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context, because the university and the education system is a little bit different in the US than it is in Australia. So many of the public universities in the US are land-grant universities. So around the mid-1800s, many of the government would give a grant of land with some money, came with it, to the state to build a university. Now, remember that they had also stolen that land from the Native Americans, but that's another talk on another night. But anyway, they had the universities, and most of the universities were focused on doing things for the people, making life better for the people. So a lot of agriculture, science and medicine. Every county had an extension office. That was an extension office from the university. You could go to the extension office and get a leaflet on just about anything you wanted. How to safely preserve food, freeze meat, canned vegetables, how to knit, how to sew, anything. So it was how to raise flowers, all kinds of things. So it was about making life better. A lot of my friends, a lot of the kids that I grew up with, especially boys that I grew up with, would go to university. They were Aggies. They would study agriculture, and they were expected to come back and to the farm. There was a lot of the universities that are in place now in the U.S. started out as normal schools. Now, I have no idea why they're called normal schools, but that was what it was. And normal schools were teacher education programs. Excuse me. My grandmother went to a normal school. And it's now Pitt State University. And it was actually, I'll show you in a slide or so, it was the first place that I taught after I got my degree. And I didn't realize that. I knew she went to school somewhere in Kansas, but until I saw her pictures, and she's standing in front of, and I'm like, I know that building. I know that building. It was right next to my office building. That was really cool. That was a neat connection. A lot of the religious-based colleges were started with a focus on theology. I went to a small Christian church, and it was supported by Culver Stockton College, which was probably about a 40-minute car ride from us. And most of the pastors that we had when I grew up were either professors or theological students. Another one that was very important in my story was Hannibal Grange. It was close to us. And now these schools were much more expensive, but there's a lot of grants, student loans. There was ways that the government would try to make them affordable for people. But I did a couple of semesters at Hannibal Grange because it was close, and by the time I went back to university, I'd gotten over the thing that I didn't need to go to university. So now I had kids, and I needed to go someplace that was close. Very, very conservative. It was a rule, if you were a professor at Hannibal Grange, you were not allowed, now forget about drinking, there was no drinking, no alcohol, but you were not allowed to be seen in any establishment that sold liquor. So Pizza Hut, Domino's, they sell beer, you can't go in, you can't be seen there, you literally could lose your job. Very, very conservative. So overall, and I'm going to get into these different parts of it, but overall, the timeline, so from around 1975, I got married in 1975 to first that quarter of a century. My focus was on being a mom. I had 3 kids and an education advocate because I had all 4 of my children, and I don't say this as a point of pride, although I'm very, very proud of my children. All 4 of my children were identified fairly early as gifted. That does not make them easy to be around at all. It makes them very, very difficult. My oldest son was very shy and compliant, did whatever he was asked to do. My next son is the typical middle child. Everything that's wrong in his life is my fault, and he tells me about it anytime he gets a chance. My third son, Randy, we know that God did not give me Randy as a first child for a reason. I would never have had any more kids. He was, from the time when he was a baby, he didn't sleep at all. Until he was about 7 years old, he would sleep about 2 out of every 24 hours. I can remember, and I was separated from their dad when Randy was 2 months old. I spent many, many nights where I would just lay on the sofa. I'd put this little pile of toys and things, to keep him occupied, and he would sit there and, and talk and play with things, and I'd kind of doze off and on, but he would never sleep. He just wouldn't sleep at all. But he was, now by the time I got into university and I worked with kids with severe behaviors, we were out somewhere, Randy was in high school, and somebody said, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I work with kids with severe behaviors." And Randy would say, "It's because of me, it's because of me." And he wasn't that far wrong. But he is reason for hope. Him and 2 of my boys are both, Randy and his brother are both robotics engineers. They do really, really well. I used to say that I got calluses on my knees because I prayed for Randy so much. My goal was that he would get to be 18 and he wouldn't be in jail, and he would still be alive. He's done really, really well. He has, he makes a good living. He's got a beautiful daughter, Aaliyah, that you see in that first. That's Aaliyah, was my first grandchild. Adorable, adorable girl. And he's married. He's got a stable relationship. He's a Christian. There is hope. So whatever you go through with your kids, there is hope. Trust me. So anyway, I'm going down rabbit holes. I do that a lot. So my focus was on advocating for my kids, all of my kids, to make sure that they got the best education. I was about as far away from education as you could get. I was in sales. I worked in sales a lot, primarily because, again, I didn't have a degree. I didn't have a lot of education qualifications. I worked in sales jobs where I worked on straight commission. I could make more money. And I usually had more flexibility, with my kids. So that worked out good. And I kept going to school. I used to tell people every time I got married, got divorced, had another child, I'd go back and do another semester or so at university. Somebody said, well, if you have a lot of education, I'm really going to worry about you. And I said, you should worry about me. I've got a lot of education. But one of the things, one time I went to, I think Randy was in about year 3, and it was like the second day of school, first day of school, second day of school. And so I stopped in to see his teacher. She happened to be someone I knew. And I said, how's Randy doing? And she says, Cindy, it's first day of school, And I said, how's his behavior? She said, oh yeah, we can talk about that. So I said, you have got to keep him busy. Don't worry about giving him extra work, that'll be okay. But if he has 30 seconds to do something and he doesn't have anything to do, he will find something to do and it won't be good. So keep him busy. But I went through that and went every year. I had to go back and advocate, and I learned so much about good things about the education system and things that I didn't really think were good either. Now, in 2000, or in 1999, I got married to Bob. A lot of you all are from church here. You know Bob, my husband. He is English. Anyway, we lived in the U.S. for 15, 17 years, something like that. But anyway, he moved to Hannibal, this really, really small conservative, town. And I was working, at that time, I was working in, it was still sort of sales, but it was in like business finance. So I called on retail businesses a lot, and I did have to travel, some. And I was coming home one day. It was the last trip before I was going to be finished until, it was like 1st of December, and I was going to be finished until January. And I was coming home from Michigan. It had been a really good trip, and I thought, 50 years from now, is anyone going to care that I got $70,000 for this man? They're happy, but is anybody going to care or know? Is it going to make any difference at all? And, and I'm having to travel, I'm away from home, and I really don't think I want to do this anymore. So I went home and I told, bless his heart, I told my husband, Bob, I said, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And he was like, okay, so what do you want to do? And I said, I think I want to go back to school. I want to teach. I want to do something different. He's like, okay. And now he won't admit this, but I think he thought that if I just kind of, go along with this, she'll come back to her senses soon, and come back to reality. But I never really have. One time, every time I would graduate, do another, did my undergraduate and then my master's, my PhD, all my kids would come, my graduations, although Randy said I think it was, I was getting ready for my PhD, he said, Mom, don't you really think you're taking this school thing a little too far? Just getting a little bit too much into this. But with this was where I really got it was during this period that I got my calling, because one of the first, when I decided, I quit my job, but I needed to do something, I got a job working as a teacher, no degree that tells you how badly they needed teachers, but it was in an early childhood program called Head Start. And my kids had actually gone to Head Start. Now, one of the things, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit because it's really important, but one of the things about the Head Start program was that you had to be poor. It was a need-based program. And remember, when I was I had all these kids and I was single, so I qualified, quite well. Most of the good parenting skills that I have, I learned from the teachers there at Head Start. Because one of the things, one of their premises is that if your kids go to Head Start, you have to volunteer. You have to be there. You can be in the classroom, there's lots of different things you can do, but you have to be involved. So they're not only teaching the kids, but they're teaching the parents and looking at the whole family. And when I was, some of the kids that I was working, it was really, 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 really sad. And when I would see kids who had been through all different kinds of trauma, one of the saddest cases I had, there's a little boy that was about 3, and he was so angry, just so angry. He had so much rage in him, but I connected with him somehow. He was a kid that nobody wanted to work with, but somehow or another, we connected on that. And that was really where I felt called to work with kids that nobody else wants to. This kid had spent about the first year and a half of his life pretty much living in a dog crate. The only time that he came out of this crate was if someone was going to abuse him, in some way. It was such a sad case. And when you see kids like that who have gone through so much, and they're still, now a lot of their coping strategies aren't good, they need some help with that, but they're coping, they're doing the best they can, they're trying so hard. And one thing that it doesn't do well for me is that the more I work with kids that are working so hard to cope and managing, it makes me really lose patience with adults, when I think, we have so much, we really have it so easy, and the things that we complain about, seriously, so somebody's 10 minutes late or 10 minutes early, who cares, there's so much. So my calling was to work with kids that nobody else really wanted to work with them. But what I have found is that there are such hidden gems, in these kids. They have so much, and there's so much things that value that they can add to our society that we're just going to miss, and not get, if we can't help them find ways that they can cope and know more about them. One of the miracles that I saw, one of the things that I did when I was in school, I worked at a homeless shelter for children. I've worked with a lot of different agencies and places for kids. This one, I didn't do that very long. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I was only about 6 months. I just couldn't do it. But it was actually, it was well funded. It was a really nice place. But there was a lot of times I would work on Sundays because they didn't, oftentimes we didn't have as many kids on a Sunday. We would get more kids on like Monday or Tuesday, but not necessarily, after the weekend, after things had happened, but not necessarily on the weekend. But we had a van. We were encouraged to take the kids out in the community, do things with them. So I worked on Sunday and I took the kids to church with me. It was, seems like a win-win thing to me. This is one little guy that was there. He was it was a failed foster home placement. The foster family said, we just can't manage this kid. You need to come get him. So we had him there, I don't know, about a month or so before they found another placement for him. So I had several times I got to take him to Sunday school with me, and he was all over me. He was always climbing on me. He was ruffling my hair, and I never sat still or anything. But we had, so he had, we talked about God and talked about the stories that he heard in Sunday school, and had some cool conversations. So then I also worked on 4th of July. Remember I told you my husband was a Brit? 4th of July is not a real big day, in our house when you're living with a Brit. So anyway, I worked on 4th of July. I think I got time and a half probably. But I took at the university, they had this huge fireworks display. So I've got this, the same little guy who's climbing all over me, and then, of course, they're late, getting the fireworks started, standing out there. And so finally, they have this huge explosion, of color. Just all of these beautiful fireworks. And this little guy just goes still, and he looks up and he says, Miss Cindy, says, is that God up there? And I'm like, oh my gosh. That to me was a miracle. That was to have his heart opened. It was like, okay, so yeah, I know it's just, it's firecrackers that somebody has paid for, but if he can relate the majesty of, creation and to God, that's a wonderful place to start. We can work with that. That was really, really cool. Okay, so I'm going to tell you more about, I started out in Missouri. After I graduated, I went to Pitt State, which was the same place my grandmother had gone to normal school to be a teacher. And then I ended up in Saudi Arabia and then here in Perth. Oh, I did have a stop in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. But you can go on, and I'll tell you more about each one of these things. So this is just at we had this beautiful old campus. Remember, it was built in like 1800s. We had these gorgeous, really neat buildings there. I finally got through school and finished up with my degree. When I went back, I told you I started teaching without a degree, but they paid for some of my education classes, so that was cool. But then when I started teaching with a degree in special education on a provisional certificate. So again, because there's a shortage of special ed teachers, but I had to go on and get more training, within a certain amount of time. So I was doing that, and the state paid for a lot of my training. I finished my master's teaching. I was working, and I taught for about 5 years in special education setting. My kids had different diagnoses. Some was autism, some was just from environmental trauma. Some had intellectual disabilities, some were identified as gifted, but they all had behaviors that kept them out of the mainstream, setting. And they were, if they got in trouble, they usually ended up in my class. I also did a lot of consultation with the other teachers to try to, around classroom management, that kind of thing. But I went back, I decided I wanted to continue and do my PhD. So I went, as part of the process, I had to have an interview with Dr. Lewis, who ended up being one of my advisors. And so I went in, he said, so, you want to do a PhD? I said, what do you want to do? It's a lot of work, do you really need one? And I said, we have got too many kids that we are not serving in school. If we have just one or two, that are falling through the cracks, we can deal with that, on a case-by-case basis, but we've got a lot of them. We are not serving the kids. We need to change the way that we train teachers, the way that we run our classrooms, and I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of changing the policies and doing something about that. And he says, yeah, maybe you do. Maybe you should come along. So anyway, went through that. While I was in my program, I worked as a behavior therapist, working with families with children with severe behaviors. I told you, in the children's shelter, a lot of different things like that. But I was always working with kids that nobody else wanted to. Oftentimes they had just written off. And my husband kept saying, well, what are you going to do? What's the next step? And I said, I don't know what the next step is. God hasn't told me yet. I'm going to go as far as I can see. When I get there, then he will tell me how to go farther. And, at the moment I'm in Perth. We'll see, what my next step is. Okay. So one of the, I'm going to just tell you briefly about a couple of the theorists that really have impact my research and my understanding. So Bronfenbrenner was a psychologist. He was at Cornell, and he was very, very influential in Head Start. He worked with U.S. government, with President Lyndon Johnson, who started the War on Poverty, said that, one of the things that we need to do, we need to have an even footing, for all of our kids. Definitely hasn't solved all the problems. If you've seen the news, you know that. But we try to take baby steps, I guess. But one of Bronfenbrenner's things was he came up in this era of the 60s and 70s. So, of course, psychology overall was a fairly new discipline. And it was, we thought that everything had to be in a clinical setting. You had to isolate everything. You guys that are, in hard sciences, you know that you've got to be in the clinic. You've got to isolate all of your variables. You've got to take out all of this noise. And Bronfenbrenner said, no, You can't isolate a kid from all of the messiness, all the noise that's going on around it. You've got to work with that. You can't isolate all those variables. You've got to accept those variables and see how they're influencing the kids. So one of his major things was his idea of nested development. So the individual is in the center of this, and all of the influences that affect this child are all around them. And it's all the things that you would expect, like his caretakers, family and all of that. But it's also things like where his parents work. That affects the kid. Think about it, if a child's parents, if they're not happy with where they work, if they're very stressed, if they're not making enough money, if they feel like they're not appreciated, that affects their ability to interact with their child, in a positive way. So all of those things, affect the child. So we have, it starts out from the things that immediately affect them, but then the community, the larger community. And we get up to the things about, their social norms, our cultural practices, our understandings, what part of the world we live in, who we are, who our influencers are. And then the chronosystem is all of these different circles and how they interact over time. So what I've been telling you tonight, my story of where I came from, all of those affect who I am today, not just what happened then. Remember I told you I was in this little, very conservative community. You had to be accepted. You needed to be a certain way. You need to look a certain way, have a certain color of skin, have a certain way of believing. And if you weren't, you were not accepted. I never met anybody that was different from me until I was an adult. I was told, just as a matter of fact, that some people are just better than other people. Some people are smarter than other people because of what their skin color is, where they live, who they are. And I had no way to learn differently than that until I got out of school and I met people. I'm like, these are actually pretty nice people, They seem pretty smart, too, and I started questioning the things that I had been taught all of those years. So another, I guess, important thing for me is that I really enjoy being around people who are from marginalized communities. I do a lot of my research is around LBGT, communities. When my husband's daughter was here for a while back from England, of course, we always, trying to think of fun things for her to do, and we invited friends. And after the second or third thing we'd done, she says, "Do you have any straight friends? We haven't met any." But people who have lived in marginalized communities, they know what it is to not be accepted, not be accepted for who they are. And oftentimes they have a lot more empathy. They're really fun people, to be around. So another important theorist was Bandura. Now, Bandura was, he came up, there was the big, the psychology movement around behaviorism, which I am a behaviorist. I'm a card-carrying behaviorist, for sure. I believe that we do more of what we're rewarded for, and we do less of what we're not rewarded for. But Bandura says there's a little bit more to it than that. So his idea of social learning, that we learn by observing, what other people do, what we're around, what we observe, but we've got to be able to connect. So one of his most famous experiments was the Bobo doll experiment, where they put these kids in a room and they had an adult who went in and, it's one of these dolls that, you hit it and it bounces and bounces back. So they had people go in and just hit this doll and, pick it up on the floor and drop it and be really, really mean to this doll. And then they left the kids there, and the kids hit the doll, was really, really mean to it, did all of this kind of stuff. Now, lots of his work has gone a lot farther, and we understand that it's not as simplistic as just watching violence and being violent. There's a lot more to it than that. But he was one of the first that said, yes, if kids are exposed to violence, exposed to antisocial behavior, they're going to learn that. A lot of the laws around like censorship, on TV, what we could do or not, was because of Bandura's work. Now, something that's really important, if you see it's in small letters, but where it talks about the observational learning, the attention, retention, reciprocation, and motivation. This is 4 very, very important things, because basically you've got to be able, if you're going to learn something, you've got to be able to attend to it. You've got to pay attention long enough, to be able to take in that cognitively. And then you've got to have that attention so that you retain that information. But then you've also got to interact with whoever or whatever is giving you that information, and you've got to care. It's got to be something important enough to you that you're actually going to learn. The children that I work with that have autism don't have these qualities naturally. They really have a hard time with learning by watching other people. They need to be directly taught. But we can teach those attributes. We can help them be able to gain learning from watching, other people. And that is really, that research has come out in the last maybe 10, 15 years or so, and it's a really big, an important step to being able to help children learn with autism. Yeah. So some of the research areas that I work in, I'm kind of eclectic, but not really so much, because most of my work is around building relationships, about how people build relationships to be able to be more successful, socially successful, to be able to learn, all these different things. So the top of it is around mentoring, being able to connect with other people, to have that learning. My PhD was around adolescent mentoring, but I studied the mentors, because some of the research that had just come out at that time was that we can hook a kid up, with a mentor, and that should work, but more than 60% of the mentoring relationships would end in less than 6 months. And we found that having a kid with severe issues that hasn't had anybody who, as Ron from Butter said, thought he was, the most wonderful thing in the world. They hadn't had anybody care about them. If they have a mentor, another adult that starts and then goes away, that can actually be more damaging than not having the mentor to start with. So that's really, really important. So I looked at, why is that happening? And how can we change that? So what I found was that for a lot of the mentors, they would, these are kids who haven't had an adult that they could trust, that stayed long term. If they assume that this person's probably going to go away anyway, so I'll see if I can make it happen a little bit faster. If I'm really mean to them, then they'll go away and we'll be done, and then I won't have this pain, to deal with. So the mentors had to understand that, and had to be able to withstand that testing period, and then they could develop the relationship. A lot of my work, these kids with issues aren't there in a vacuum. And there are very few people in this world who have kids, I believe, that don't want to be good parents. They want to do the absolute best for their kids. Now, there's a lot of people who they don't do things that are the best for their kids, but it's not because they don't want to. It's often because they don't know how. And then we have this, and then these kids grow up and they haven't had good role models, and so, they, do things that harm their kids, or at least not the best. So a lot of my work is around women's studies. How do we support parents? How do we support teachers? Again, building relationships across all of these things. And then, of course, the gender diversity. I believe very, very strongly that everybody has a right to be who they are, and they should be able to be open and proud of who they are. So a lot of the Yeah, I work with a lot of issues around gender. Okay, go ahead. So again, remember I said that, I really can't separate. Excuse me, this minute. I can't separate all of these different areas. So when I was at the University of West Georgia, these 4 little boys, adorable boys here, my grandchildren, they came up and spent a week with me. My husband thought it was the craziest thing we ever did, but it was really, really fun. My pastor, when I first moved it was just outside of Atlanta, University of West Georgia. So and I'm telling him that I'm in special education. And he said, I was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD. He was from South Georgia, which again, very rural area. His mother was a school teacher. He said, I always struggled in school. He said, I can remember sitting at, getting this report card, with really bad marks on it, and said, my dad said, well, maybe he's just not as smart as we thought he was. Maybe he just can't do it. It was just, he said, I just felt so bad. He went to university on a football scholarship. If you're in Georgia, you play football. And he flunked out. But he said then of course, that was, a horrible thing and, a lot of shame for his family. But somebody noticed him and they said, I see what's going on here. So it wasn't that he couldn't learn. He needed different supports and to be able to focus and to be able to learn. So he got some help. He had some people help him. He went back to university, studied theology. Now he's a Methodist minister. Now he still struggles. He still needs support. He said, we were moving house one day and said I had the big truck that I'd rented, forgot to put gas in it. We ran out, all this stuff. So he's still going to need supports, but he knows how to manage. He came and spoke to one of my first-year classes, special education classes, and told them about his experiences, what it was like to be a child that, wanted to learn, but really, really struggled. What it was like to be a university student and not be able to learn. And it was really, really powerful for all of those pre-service teachers. You see these, now these, I'm sorry, these are really, the print's really small. I know you can't see it. But this is the Girl Power, the one at the bottom. That's one of the projects that I did, research projects I did when I was in Georgia. So we started a mentoring program, a girls' mentoring program at a school, local school there. And it was most of the kids that went there were very, very poor. We gave the school psych a checklist, and she scored the kids like if they had at least one parent in that was incarcerated, if there was, a history or suspicion of abuse, all of these different risk factors. And so we took the kids that had the highest risk. And I had no funding for this project. And everybody said, well, you think you're going to get university students to go and volunteer, do something like this? And I said, yeah, I think they will. Because what I have found is that, we often think, and I'm not saying that we should exploit, our kids. I don't mean that. But I think sometimes we have, as academics, as university people, we have something that's much more powerful than money. We have our knowledge. We have our experience. And I think our students will take the opportunity to share that. And I think they will feel like that's valuable enough to spend the time. So, when I recruited people, I said, okay, so do you want to volunteer? Do you want to learn more about working with kids? A lot of these people were either in social work or in teacher ed, programs. You've got to be willing to commit to 2 semesters, so it's almost for a year, 2 afternoons a week, for all this time. You're going to have to drive. It's out in the country. You're going to have to get your own transportation and do this, yourself. Do you want to do it? And I had about 15 students. So some of these were some of our mentors. Now, something I found, if you're working with students, you need to have food. Students will come where there's food. I always cooked. But they were, yeah, and some of these, they went on to be teachers. They've done some really, really wonderful things. The other one was the writing internship program. Now, this is something I'm doing at Curtin, but I started this in Georgia. When we were there and we had, you know, every year at the end of the year, we would have a group of students that, you have the students that do really well, and then you have the students that, no, their marks aren't so good, you know. So we would meet, what are we going to do with these students? And we had a group of students that absolutely could not write. I mean, they're going to be teachers, for God's sake, and they can't put a sentence together. You know, so said, well, maybe we should just counsel them out of the program to do something else. And I said, well, maybe, but, you know, how did we learn to write? Nobody's born knowing how to write, you know, and it's really hard sometimes. I learned by making a lot of mistakes. I learned by doing a lot of writing with people who did know how to write. So I did the same thing. I said, okay, you have been selected because we feel like you have the potential for leadership. So I didn't say, I absolutely told the truth. They did have a lot of potential. They weren't showing it at the moment, but they had a lot of potential. So we are going to do a summer program, and you can come along. Now, you've got to commit. You've got to write an essay, tell me why you want to be there. You've got to have somebody recommend you, and you've got to commit to being there for, I don't know, I think we said 14 days across the summer, you know, period. And you will get to help us with our research projects, you know, with our writing. So we brought them along beside us, you know, to write. So the two girls here at the end, they were just about ready to fail. They were on their way out. They both became two of my first writing interns. They finished their program. They finished their master's degree. I took them to Savannah, Georgia. They presented with me at a program around this project. So they went on and got a paid position as research assistants in this. And they were girls that everybody said, oh, maybe they're just not going to make it, you know? But they had the potential. Go ahead. I know I've talked a long time, and I could literally talk all night. This was a program for when I was at Pitt State. They were a small school, but they had a really strong international student program. And these are all international students who were there from all over the world, and they had this event. Now, the girl that's in the corner, she's from Taiwan. She actually came and visited us, spent a week with us last winter. Still keeps in touch. Bob is on Facebook with her and all this sort of thing. It was just really cool. West Georgia, it was a tenure track position. Everything was going really well. And then I ended up, somebody said, I'm going to take a position in Saudi Arabia at this private school, and you know what? They're looking for somebody to develop a program for autism. You should come. You should send them your CV. And I said, yeah, I don't think so. So, but, one more thing. My husband, who I told you was a Brit, while I was still in grad school, we had made the mistake of visiting his daughter who had immigrated to Australia. He absolutely fell in love with Australia. Came back telling everybody, we're going to immigrate. We're going, and I'm like, we are? You know, I've got all these kids here. You know, that's a long way away, you know. So I said, we've been talking about going overseas. You know, I've got someone who wants us to go to Saudi Arabia. What do you think? And he said, are you nuts? Why on earth would we do that? Of course we're not. So anyway, we did end up going. We were there for about a year and a half. I developed a master's program to train teachers to work with children with autism. These are some of the wonderful people that I have. This was really important to my faith journey because I had to live in a country for 2 years where it was illegal to say that I was a Christian. I couldn't wear a cross. The first thing I did when I got to Perth was put on a cross. I couldn't take a Bible with me. Now, I did the second time when I went out and came back in. This Bible, I still have it. I bought it at Barnes & Noble for about $15 because I thought, okay, I'm going to try to get it through, and at least if they take it, you know, It's $15. I can get another one when I go out again. But it's really been special to me because it's been there, for a long time. But I found that there was a Christian community there, but they were underground. They were secret. I wasn't there long enough for them to trust me enough to get to go to any of the services. But it was a humbling experience. Now, I had this one really good friend. I had a lot of good friends, but this one woman she was American. She had lived in Saudi for about 30 years. But somehow we got connected. We started this program to support women who were married, who were expats, who were married to Saudi, because that's a very special subset of issues. But at the second year I was there, it was right before Christmas, and my birthday's around Christmas, and I was feeling really homesick. And of course, I couldn't have any decorations. We were living, on the compound. So the compound had lots of, security. You couldn't, and definitely if you were a Saudi, it was really hard, to get in. But I opened up my phone rang one day, and this, it was the guard at the compound. He said, Dr. Cindy said, "You've got a visitor." I'm like, okay. So anyway, about 5 minutes later, she comes in. So here is Sharifa, who is completely covered. She always completely, veiled, her face. And she's at my door, and she's got a Christmas tree and, all of these decorations, all of these Christian decorations in her hand. And, this very conservative Muslim woman. But she said, "Oh, I knew, if you know where to," they've always got some stuff under the table if you know where to shop. So she had gone and gotten all of these things because she knew it was important to me, And so she came in, I put up the decorations. I told her about the celebrations, my family that I was missing, and we had the most lovely day. So you don't have to think the same. One thing that I have learned is that everybody is on a journey. They don't have to be at the same point that I do. So probably a lot of things I've said tonight you may or may not agree with. That's okay. If we all talk together, there'd be a lot of things that we don't agree. If we're all in agreement, then why do we need universities? They could be just one of us and we could say the truth and be done with it. It's about learning. It's about discussing. It's about exploring new ideas. That's who we should be as academics. And as Christians, I feel like that we should be the leaders, in that. We should be the leaders in exploring new ideas and more what is truth and what is best, for our world. Yeah. So this is one of the projects that I'm working on now, and we're located here, is working with children with autism. We started out, and it's a long journey. We'll have to have another night, and I'll tell you more about it. But we started out a couple of years ago with about 6 little kids, and I had one PhD student. She's the lovely lady with the green hair over there. Now I think we've got about 32 kids that are enrolled. We deliver services about 150, 160 hours a week. We've trained about 24 teachers. We have an internship, a mentoring program that our teachers go through. Some of them will stay and work with our kids. Some of them will go off to other schools and take that information, that knowledge to mainstream schools so that we can multiply ourselves. Now, the woman with the ball hat over there, she is Saudi. I met her. She was a graduate of Darul Hekma. Then she went on and did her master's and her PhD at Columbia University in New York, and that's the program that we're modeling here. So she works with us remotely. Now, this is not a filler. This picture right here is Hotero. Hotero is a gecko. I'm an official gecko handler. The Australian government says so we got to believe it. We had a little boy who, when he started, it took us 2 weeks to get him to come inside the door. He was just he didn't like to be around people, and he hadn't had good experiences being around people, but he loves geckos. We got a gecko. So he brings some of his geckos sometimes, Hotero sometimes. One night, Hotero did a sleepover at his house because he got in the other cage, and anyway, but he survived. It was all good. We have, this is my Saudi student who just graduated. She did her PhD here. Now she's gone back to Saudi, and give her a hand. We just got her thesis back from the examiners. She passed. She's got very minimal revisions to make, and she's doing that. So she's going back and teaching at her university in Saudi. Yeah. This was a trip we went to India last year. We visited some schools in India who worked with children with disabilities, and there was people there from all over the world who were special education teachers and researchers. And then this was a trip we went we went to Panama last year to another. We got to visit schools in Panama. I got to see the Panama Canal. And then the woman here in the middle, she presented at this conference that I was at. And I was standing there, and she said, so the first screen comes up, and she says, I teach in Columbia, Missouri. She teaches at the same school district that I taught when I lived there. So we are collaborating. She started a new program to working with kids that are at risk, in danger of not graduating. So we are she very kindly gave her materials that they had developed. They are mentoring us to develop a similar program here in Perth for our kids. Yeah, so this is just to show you that we're working with people all over the world. We're sharing this knowledge, sharing our knowledge, learning from them, and it's, I don't think these kind of connections, they don't happen randomly. God has a plan for us. I'm convinced that He has a plan for all of us. He has a plan for what I'm doing, and it's very, very intentional. We just have to, I think, get out of the way sometimes and let Him do His work. Let Him see what needs to be done. Yeah. At the conference, I took another one of my PhD students. She does a project. She ran a project with Curtin where they did. They had a mentoring program for women in STEM, for young girls, to have mentors. So we had mentors or people who were either students, women students in the sciences, or they worked in like a STEM area and came and I think it ran for about 12 weeks. It was really cool. The man in the middle, this is Dick Durbin. He was presented an award. He's a senator from Illinois, and he's been in the Senate for more than 50 years, and he was given an award for all of the mentoring programs that he supported, all the work that he does with children. And he is absolutely as abhorred by Trump as I am, too. But he was, but it was really cool that I got to see him. And then I presented at this conference. Again, you can't read it, but it's mentoring to support students who are diagnosed with autism and are also gifted. And then the next two slides are just some of give you examples of my research. If you're really interested, which it's really boring stuff, so I'm sure that you're not, but I wanted to give you an idea of the type of things that I've done, and there's something on this slide and the next slide, you can go ahead. It's just kind of a representative of some of the publications I have from the different areas. So working with women in academia, how we can benefit from mentoring to children, to supporting teachers, to supporting our university students. So thank you so much for bearing with me. I know that I've talked for a long, long time. Just a couple of things that I wanted to end with, and this is I wanted to read you just a short passage from Corinthians. The first one says, "For the body does not consist of one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an ear, I do not belong to the body, and that would not make it any less part of the body." We all have a purpose. We're all different, and that's a good thing. If we were all the same, most of us would be redundant. So we need people with our differences, with our different ideas, our different ways of thinking, and our different ways of looking at the world. And that makes the world better for all of us. And then finally, and if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I have nothing at all. So we can sometimes we get full of ourselves as academics. We think that we're really, really smart, but in the total scheme of things, as with what in God's view, we're actually a grain of sand. So it needs all of us together, and we need to understand that it's important to know things and do things, but it's also important to care about each other and build those relationships. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I think you're okay to get some questions now. And Kevin's going to take a microphone around to anyone who's got a question so we can all hear the questions. Please, the floor is open for people to ask questions.
Thanks very much, Cindy. I just had a curious question, because I do remember reading about it years ago. But is the Head Start program still existing in any kind of form in America?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does still exist. And it's in most all communities. You find Head Start a lot of inner city schools or inner city areas where there's a lot of poverty, or in rural areas where, again, there's a lot of poverty. But yes, it does still exist. When I was teaching, they had started now the kids I worked with were 4 years old, but they found in this small community, and this was a community with about 50,000 people in Hannibal, Missouri, and there was 50 churches in this small community, and they had, one year, they had 83 girls that were under 15 who had babies, and one of them was living under the bridge with this baby. So they started it was a Head Start program for 2- and 3-year-olds, because these young girls, they couldn't go to school. They had these children to take care of. So to provide childcare, for these, to support these girls. But it was a Head Start project. So yeah, it does still go on.
Okay, so just a bit of a controversial question. But what do you say to people who come up with this crazy notion that it's the vaccines that's causing the autism in children?
Yeah, that is, unfortunately, those kind of myths are very persistent. That research was debunked years and years ago. That was actually, I use this example sometimes if I'm teaching like a research class around ethics, because this was actually, the researcher falsified his data. And got a lot of money from it and all that sort of thing. But yeah, that's completely debunked, has no basis in reality. But good question.
Maybe I have a question. So in your so many years of experience in in this area, have you come across anything, or maybe dealt with people, or through your experiences where you found that it's kind of challenging your faith as a Christian?
Yeah, there's been, if being a Christian was easy, then yeah, we'd all have different lives, wouldn't we? But yeah, there's lots of. One of the things that was challenging for me when I was teaching in the classroom, of course, in the United States, there's this whole big thing about taking prayer out of schools, and we can't pray in schools, and I prayed in my school every day. I prayed in front of my kids because the law does not say that you can't pray, in schools. I'm an American. I was there. I can pray anywhere I want to at any time, and I was really hoping somebody would tell me that I couldn't. Now, what I cannot do, I cannot require someone else to pray. I definitely can't require those children, to pray. I can't proselytize my beliefs, on them, unduly. But I can pray, so we often, we had a lot of challenges in our classroom. So sometimes if we just needed a moment, I'd say, guys, everybody be quiet. And the kids knew soon, didn't take long, they'd say, oh, stop. Miss Smith's got to pray. And so I said, I need to pray right now. I need a minute. Your job, you don't have to pray, but your job is to be quiet and respectful for a minute while I pray. And it was, So it was a way that I could build my faith. I needed to pray sometimes, I really did. But I also could demonstrate my faith, to people around me.
I've just recently saw more discussion than any research on autism, and especially nonverbal autism with psychic abilities, with telekinesis, lots of different things. And I just wondered whether that was just something that was baseless, or something that you've seen or heard of.
I can't say that it's baseless because I don't know, anything about it. I do know what's interesting. When I was at University of West Georgia, they had a psychic program. It was one of the few. I think there's only like 2 in the United States, and they were one of them. And there were some really interesting lectures, that I got to go to there. But as far as a connection between autism and that, now autism is a neurological, disorder. So by definition, your brain is going to be wired differently. So I can, you could maybe build a case, for that. But I don't know of any of that research.
Okay, so you're looking at neurodiverse kids in education programs. I'm just thinking, well, sort of after they've been through education, how can we make best use of their skills and abilities in the workplace? Is anyone doing research on how to educate employers to recognize potential in neurodiverse kids and get them delivering to their full potential in the workplace?
Yeah, good point. Right now in Western Australia, 40% of adults with autism are unemployed, which is a total waste for them and for our society. As far as research, I'm not sure. Now, one of my colleagues, Telly Tan, he's a professor in engineering at Curtin. He does a lot around autism. He has had some success with starting internships, like in banks or in engineering firms. But what's really sad, I think, is that he can get people to do internships, but none of those people, to my knowledge, now unless he's had something recently I haven't heard of, but they generally don't get paid positions. They in the internship and then they're done. The employer can tick the box, we've done our bit, and then we're on. I have a young man who's working with us now. Well, probably about 40% of the teachers that I have are either diagnosed on the spectrum or not diagnosed on the spectrum, or they have ADHD, they have some type of neurodiversity. We are doing some program, it's called behavioral skills training. So where we have one young woman right now who is one of our, an educational assistant, and what we found was that she could we could take her so far. She's absolutely wonderful with children, but doing other tasks, being able to complete tasks, things like that she really struggles with. So we are doing a pilot with her where we break those tasks down into, very, small portions, and we have this specific training, program that we go through. Our plan is to take that on to employers, because again, you have a lot of people who have the technical skills, they can do everything, brilliantly, but they have no social skills. For instance, there was one intern that he was doing this internship, and he'd been there a week or so, and then he got flu, so he shouldn't be going to work. He should call in sick. So he called in, and he did that. He called in sick, but he has called in and said, "Sorry, I'm sick, can't be there today," and hung up. And so the employer said, "Well, that's really rude," and he lost his internship, because of that. So those are the kind of skills, if we can support, people, and because those skills are very teachable, you can do that, but you've got to have direct teaching, to do that. And there's, I told you about the group that's from Florida that came last year. They actually have a charter school where they serve people with disabilities from 18 to 23. Because they were finding that people with all sorts of disabilities, some severe, some not, but they could get through school and they have, special education, but then they go home and they sit. Actually, there was a large percentage of people who were committing suicide. Their health was not good because they have nothing to live for. They don't have our jobs. All of us, our job is who you are, what you do, it's your reason. And if you have nothing to do, there's nobody in your society that feels like you're valuable, So their whole thing is and then they partner with a high school that's next to them with a program of gifted kids who mentor, the people with disabilities, and they go out and they do things like serve lunches at homeless shelters, or they do all types of service projects, things that need to be done in our community. And they're getting the skills. They're learning these employable skills, by doing that and working in service. And then the kids that are gifted, they are understanding that not everybody is like me, and that's good. And everybody has valuable things to offer, even if they're different from me. And they are going to be here in July. We will do some, we will do some talks. You'll have some opportunities to hear more about the great work that they're doing. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question. I run down rabbit holes a lot.
Sorry, one more question. I suppose, speaking as someone who hated school, although I was externally a success, I've always wondered whether people who are regarded, like with ADHD especially, things like that, whether actually they're kind of more normal, and the idea of sitting kids in a class all doing the same thing is not normal. And that actually it's the schools and the system which is more of the problem than the child, but that maybe those skills that they've got equip them, or the fact that they were interested in different things and that equips them to go out and do things that other people can't do. Yeah. What do you say about that?
Yeah, exactly. The schoolroom is the most artificial environment that we have. When you think about what we do, I have a job, I like to talk to people. So I have a job where I get to talk to people. I get to, if you like to move, you have a job that gives you a lot of physical movement. You make those choices and choose your career, choose what you're doing. But kids don't get those choices. We tell them to come in and sit, and they've got to sit for hours, and they've got to do only spoken when they're spoken to. And they have all of these rules, around. This isn't real life. This is a endurance, thing. We often said in special education, if we can just get our kids through school, they'll be fine. I agree. It's why I do what I do. It's the schools that's a problem. We need to do something different, prepare our kids.
I just want to know if autistic kids are more likely to be gifted than like others.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're more likely to be gifted. There is a strong correlation. So there's a lot of kids that have autism that are also gifted. But I think probably the myth is that if someone is gifted, that they also have an intellectual disability. That they're not smart. And we definitely cannot make that assumption either. I think that's sometimes the assumption that's made and is wrong. So a lot of the kids that I work with are gifted, and whether or not they have a diagnosis being gifted, they have a lot of great qualities, but they learn in different ways, and we've got to recognize those ways. But good question, thank you.
Yes, so I believe there's a lot more kids being diagnosed with neurodiversity, be it ADHD or autism, than in the past. So just wonder what your thinking is on why that is. Is it just better diagnosis, more people coming forward for diagnosis, or is it actually on the rise, this neurodiversity?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So we definitely have a greater awareness, a greater understanding. The tools that we use to diagnose and test are much more specific. So we can see signs now of children as young as 6 months old. Doesn't mean we would make a diagnosis, but we see red flags. Eye movement. That type of thing. So we can do a lot more, and we know a lot more. Everybody has, if we all talk to everybody, has got somebody in their family that was kind of weird, and today they would probably have a diagnosis of autism, but then they were the weird people who weren't understood and were kind of shunned, and and all that sort of thing. So there's always been autism. There is. Yes, there is a greater prevalence, now. Having said that, there's a lot of research speculative research to understand, what that is. Is it something in our environment? We do know that there's a very strong genetic, component in cultures that intermarry, a lot, have a lot of intermarriage, through blood, marrying cousins, that type of thing. There's generally a higher prevalence, of autism or other types of neurodiversity. Yeah, there's a lot of different factors. There was something just come out, and I honestly didn't have, it was one of these news clips you get, and I didn't have enough, I haven't been able to investigate to see if it's one of these crazy things that comes across or if it actually had some basis in it. But evidently there's a new research that shows that some kind of, like the cots, like the plastic cots or covers that, that we lay babies on, that the chemicals, that they're made with, was harmful, to brain development. But that's just come out. And like I said, I don't know if that's something that has validity to it or if it's just, one of the goofy things we see on the news yet. But yeah, there's still a lot we don't know. Yeah.
Well, if there's no more questions, then I would like to thank you, Cindy, very, very much. That was a really, really interesting talk, hearing about your interesting life, background, career, and how you've testified to God leading you all the way through that career. And I think it's not finished yet, so yes, I think we all look forward to seeing how it goes from here. What exciting things God leads you into from here. So thank you so much. Let's give Cindy another round of applause.